Okay. All right. I don't know how to change the slides. Nope, that's not. um, all right, all right. Did I just click on? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm actually not going to share my screen. And then, is it back on my face? Nope. Hey, Carla, how do I have it go back to my face? Or actually, I think Jordan's slides. I think Jordan's kicking us off, right?
Okay. They'll switch it out in just a second. There you go.
Awesome. Okay, well, I will welcome everyone and then hand it off to our first speaker. As everyone knows, this is the University's Fighting World Hunger Summit. Has anyone ever attended in the past in person? I have. It is an amazing, I feel like I still have that energy of just a bunch of students and advocates and administrators and folks from across the country who are passionate about this issue and dedicated being in a room together. And I'm hopeful that through our Q&A, through polls, and through our amazing panelists, we'll start to feel some of that energy. This panel in particular is different than I think any other session you'll attend today, because we're going to call something out. We're going to call out that we are not going to swipe our way out of hunger. We are not going to food bank our way out of hunger. Hunger and issues of food insecurity are systemically caused and will require systemic solutions to address. Over the past year, I think our society has become very aware of what systemic change means and what systemic issues are. And so I think any of you who've chosen to attend this session know that with the issue of hunger, it's going to take people power, the same way it takes people power to accomplish anything. And so today we'll be hearing from advocates speaking about international hunger and how policy and advocacy plays a role in that realm, federal hunger in the United States, at the state level, and even advocacy and policy change at the campus level, which is really where everything gets started. We have a bunch of experts with us today, so I won't share too much more before we kick it off, but I'll just say that one of our goals with this session is to, one, have folks understand the basic technical differences between change at these different levels, and also understand key ways that you can step up, whether locally or internationally, to start to make a difference. Really, like, you don't need much more than just some knowledge and passion. Arguably, passion is even more important. Naivete is an asset when it comes to policy work, if you ask me. And so with that, I will pass it off to Jordan, and we'll figure out how to get your slides on the screen and get started. Or no slides, just face is even better.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I do have slides, so I'll wait just 1 minute for them to come up. Great. All right, so hi everybody. I am Jordan T. I'm with an organization called Bread for the World. We're a Christian advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., but we have what we call members, Bread for the World members all across the country, including in every state that you guys live in and are calling in from. So I'm going to talk about why we need to think about global food security and policy to address that. Here we go. Sorry, everybody. Okay. So we're all here because we know that hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition are issues and are global issues. Hunger was rising worldwide, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. Armed conflicts, climate change, and economic downturns really were driving all of that. And then came COVID. While the health impacts of COVID-19 are scary and serious, the economic impacts of the prevention measures that were taken to stop the spread may be even worse in terms of hunger and malnutrition, especially because in many places, policies and programs haven't been put in place to enable those who are most impacted, like people living in poverty, working for low wages. There aren't policies and programs to enable them to weather the storm yet. And yes, of course, we need all kinds of expertise and leadership to help solve hunger and malnutrition and the crises that are facing our world today. But like Rachel said, what we're here to talk about today is how policy and advocacy can play a huge role in fighting this fight. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we worked on at Bread for the World that are a little bit outside the box when you may traditionally think of anti-hunger policy and advocacy. The first one is really focusing on the ongoing crisis in Yemen. You've probably heard a lot about Yemen in the news over the past several years. Actually, this week, we've hit 6 years of the civil war in the country. And I really don't think that I have to describe to you all the ways in which war and armed conflict impacts food insecurity. In 2018, things really came to a head, at least in the international space, when it was declared that Yemen and 3 other countries actually were nearing famine. And now, once a community has declared famine, it means they're actually already in the worst possible spot for food security, for health, for livelihoods. And you may remember that the near famine conditions in Yemen were brought a little bit more close to home for us in the US, given the US military support to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who were bombing and blockading Yemen in really some direct ways leading to the hunger crisis in the country. So Bread for the World saw this connection with our military's activities and the also massive and unconscionable scale of hunger and malnutrition in the country. And we decided to launch a petition to Congress and to the administration, calling for an end to military support to the coalition led by Saudi Arabia, number one. Number two, to really heighten our diplomacy to promote peace and to promote responsible economic policies that would really help folks be able to afford the food that was available in the country. And thirdly, to really fully fund the humanitarian response in the country. We got more than 30,000 people of faith to sign this petition in just 2 weeks. So it was a really important issue for many of our members. And in subsequent years, we worked with partners, other NGOs, to do an advertisement in one of the newspapers that's delivered to every office on Capitol Hill. And on that, we got 2 pastors from every state to sign a statement that was calling for the things I mentioned, and also an end to arms sales to the coalition. So one thing you'll learn about policy and advocacy, in most cases, it takes time. In 2018, the year we did the petition, the US government did stop refueling the planes that were bombing Yemen, but 3 years later, this year in 2021, the US government ended all support to the Saudi coalition, including arms sales. So these things, while of course not going to solve the hunger crisis fully, are things that should be celebrated as part of the efforts to end the devastating hunger affecting nearly half of the country of Yemen. So what are the tools that we used in this project to achieve this win? First was really the voice of a particular constituency. For us as a Christian organization, we use the faith voice. So members of Congress, other politicians and policymakers, they may or may not subscribe to a religion. And that's important to know when we're trying to ask them to do things. We might be able to appeal to them using people who share maybe faith in common. The next thing we did is a simple tool with a petition, getting a lot of people to sign on to one short statement asking for something that we can all agree on. We used the media. So that advertisement went to every Hill office, and it was just a short but also loud and really big statement from pastors. We also really framed our advocacy around the root cause of the hunger that was happening in Yemen. Of course, we cared about sending in humanitarian aid, making sure food got to people who were in emergencies. But we also took a step back and said, what's causing the hunger in the first place, and really tried to advocate around addressing that. And then lastly, time and patience were really critical tools that we used in this. So the next one I want to talk about is what's going on with COVID-19 response and recovery. And as you've been able to tell with what our own country has done in the last year, responding to the impacts of COVID-19 takes money, and it takes a lot of it. This type of liquidity, or just cash flow, It just doesn't exist in many low income and historically colonized countries. Many governments just, number one, don't have the funds to put in place the programs needed that are needed to prevent things like hunger from becoming a big impact of the pandemic. And number two, they already have huge debts from other development programs that they're still paying on. So there are a lot of policies and proposals floating around for how to support low-income countries and addressing the impacts of COVID-19. One right now is what's called special drawing rights, or SDRs. We don't have time to get into what the incredibly complex tools, financial tools that these are, but bare bones are that if SDRs are issued, they'd give extra fiscal space or cash flow essentially to countries in order to then have money to respond to the pandemic's effects, including measures to address food insecurity. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, is responsible for issuing SDRs, but here's where advocacy comes in. The United States has veto power over this policy at the IMF because of our investment standings at the institution. So advocates have continued to engage all of the players, US Treasury, Congress, in our government, on issuing SDRs as one tool of many to address the hunger impacts of COVID-19. With something as complex as this, we've had to take multiple approaches. We've had to, number one, educate ourselves on what SDRs are and how they could be used. And then educating Congress too on what SDRs mean and how they are a tool to fight hunger. We've also, as you may imagine, gotten, there are concerns and pushback on using this type of financial tool. So we've had to develop messaging and talking points to address those legitimate concerns, but really showing how big of an impact SDRs might have on hunger and poverty around COVID-19. We've also used both individual meetings with key officials at US Treasury and Congress to really hash these issues out, and then larger briefing events like the one on the slide here to really just try and frame SDRs as a hunger and poverty issue. So we still haven't won yet, but the IMF, the US Treasury, and the G20 have all publicly supported issuing SDRs. Now it really just seems as if it's a matter of getting all the ducks in a row and putting the policy in place. So some of the tools that we used in this project were the messaging I mentioned. We really tried to frame whatever we were talking about with SDRs as to address whatever concerns the key member of Congress might have. We used, also with this, we used letters, both to Treasury, to members of Congress, which can be a critical tool to use. We also had the meetings, like I mentioned, so both individual meetings and then larger group meetings to hash out the issues, and finally public briefing events to make sure folks are educated and to show support from a wide variety of constituencies for this issue. So you may be wondering, okay, well, this is all global stuff, and I'm wherever I am in the US. We all have a role to play as we're talking about in this session. Wherever you are, you have a member of Congress. You have a senator who you can contact and talk with about whatever issue it is that you're interested in, and you can use some of the tools that I've put out here in helping that. And if Bread for the World has some tools that you can use. If you go to our website, bread.org, we have toolkits that will help you in your advocacy around hunger. So I can share that in the chat as well. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I feel like the issues that you're talking about of famine in a country where there isn't a Congress that's so easily organized, where it's much harder to understand the situation on the ground, just emphasizes for us how important it is to be able to leverage the resources and the connections that we have in order to make a difference in those places. So I'm very excited for our Q&A in just a moment. I still don't know how to change the slides. How do I go to the next slide? Oh, this is just my keys. Okay, great. Thank you again so much, Jordan. I want to also hear in the chat who in the room is interested in the issue of international hunger, issues like famine, food access, international aid. Throw in the chat like who's in the conversation, who's volunteered with Bread for the World, talked about these issues. Has everyone read in the, gosh, what's it called? The Farm Bill, all the amount of international aid that we give through that bill. So amazing. Yeah, throw it in the chat. And please make note of your questions now that you have on this issue, and we'll be diving in very soon. Thank you. And as you introduce yourself, throw in what school you're from and what brings you into the room today. So I'll bring us to a more local level. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Sumek. I don't think I properly introduced myself when opening the session, so it's so great to be with you all. Hey, Bren from Kentucky, welcome. Would love if folks continue to introduce themselves in the chat. My name is Rachel Sumek, and I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Swipe Out Hunger. Can I just switch to not having slides up for a moment? Whatever, it's fine, let's leave it. And we at Swipe Out Hunger are committed to making sure that college students, as you see on the slide here, don't go hungry. We're a national nonprofit ensuring that students, what we're most known for, I should say, is that students who have extra money on their meal plans have the chance to donate those dollars to other students on campus who are hungry. If you are a student who's ever had extra meal swipes, I hope you're at a campus that's giving you the chance to donate them, or you've gone out on your own and found a way to share those meal swipes with your peers. Nationally, 1 in 3 students are food insecure, and that is 1 in 3 too many. Our work really has 3 core principles. Oh, this is a fun meme. How it started, how it's going. We started in 2010 at UCLA in a food closet where we convinced UCLA to let us at least donate the money from our meal plans, which they then used to buy food, which we then donated to our campus pantry. I don't know if I can just do a poll real quick, but I'll do a poll. This will take too long, but I want to know how many of your schools have pantries on campus? Probably most of them, I would assume. And so our work has grown from just being in a pantry to now 130 universities where, of course, we work with pantries. We love pantries. They are make such an impact, but has definitely grown beyond that as well to many other areas of support. As I mentioned, 130 campuses, 2 million meals served. And what's important to note is now we've passed over $50 million in legislation to end student hunger. Our work has 3 pillars. As you know, our swipe program where students can donate their meal swipes and they're added onto the accounts of other students. But then also our campus solutions. We go beyond swipe drives and we provide consulting. Oh, I see Ashlyn Anderson in the room who's leading our program at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Our campus solutions that students like Ashlyn are helping lead on the ground, student empowerment, making sure that students have the resources they need to step up as leaders. We host an annual summit every year. We make sure that students have training and support throughout the year. And really this highlighted one, which I'll be focusing mostly on today, is our policy and advocacy work, where we focus on creating change upstream. So the state legislature, my session today, today, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the issue of student hunger, or not student hunger, hunger as a whole. We're focused on student hunger at different levels. Jordan talked about the role that the US plays in international relief. It's a very important role. And that's typically at the federal, we work with federal governments and NGOs to create change at that level. And many people think about Congress, but there's a lot of power that happens at our state legislatures. So every state has a legislature. There's typically 2 houses. You might call them a house, a Senate, an assembly, House of Delegates, all kinds of names, essentially 2 houses that do the same things. And in order for a bill to pass at the legislature, there's a couple quick steps. One is the bill is introduced by a legislator. So you'll have an idea. For instance, we had the idea to pass a bill that would address college student hunger. We got a legislator on board with introducing the bill. Our bill had to do with education. So the bill went to the education committee. They decided if they liked it or not. Various legislators are assigned to committees. They said, this is a pretty good bill. We were asking for a lot of money. We asked for millions of dollars. So then it had to go to appropriations. And they said, do we have money for this? Let's check our balance books. And if the appropriations committee said, okay, it goes to the floor. And in the first house that it's introduced in, it passes on the floor. Simultaneously, this could be happening in the other house. It goes to the same committees, same appropriations on that side. Eventually, both houses sign it, and it goes to the governor to be signed. This is a very simplified way of me explaining it, but I wanted to explain that it really isn't this like unknown world. These are the steps, and I was a 26-year-old who had no idea how any of this worked, and it just works. And so, I mean, it doesn't always work, but for the most part, it works. And so we've been able to pass significant legislation in California, in New Jersey, and now just in Maryland this past week, and are continuing to do so in various states. Meetings with legislators. So how many of you have ever attended a meeting with a legislator? I'm assuming more than one or two, right? You meet with your representative to talk about issues that you're passionate about, issues that are important to you. And we at Swipe Out Hunger believe that no one is more qualified or equipped to be meeting with legislators about the issue of student hunger than students themselves. So this is a screenshot of a number of our student advocates. And you'll see here that can't really see their names, but this is the staff of Senator Tina Smith, who's our federal senator from Minnesota. And our students, before this had a prep session with our director of advocacy, Rob, where we had the chance to prep our students and say, this is what the climate might be right now. Let's make sure that we have our talking points down. And in surprise to no one, our students had the story down. Something that they did really well was talking about three things: appealing to the legislator's head, heart, and hands. In a lot of ways, how do we get this person headwise, bringing the right data, talking about the issue so that they feel compelled? Then it was their heart. How do we get a tearjerker in there, right? Students can talk about their own experiencing hunger, the students of their peers who they sit next to every day who experience hunger. And their hands is, well, now what do we do, right? We're asking for you to make sure that SNAP increases. We're asking for you to make sure that this bill is introduced, that you review eligibility in the Farm Bill. And so we want to make it as tangible as possible for folks as well. And this goes to the next slide. Oop. So what is the Hunger Free Campus Bill? I'm going to share a bit about this in an effort to demonstrate how our bill passed, and also just highlight a bill that if you're an advocate in your state and you want to get more involved, this is one bill that you can pick up. I'll name that if you go to our website, swipehunger.org, you'll see a number of states outlined that have already introduced this bill: Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Illinois, Minnesota, New York. Like, this bill is on fire in so many wonderful ways, and we need more student advocates who are ready to step up. So if you either are in one of those states or want this introduced in your state, let us know. For those of us in California, this bill has been in place in 2017, where we first piloted it. It was an incentive bill. We didn't want to punish schools or have some requirements. We said, what are schools already doing? If they have meal plans, they're already starting swipe programs. They're already establishing food banks or some sort of food pop-up, and they're already doing SNAP enrollment. So how do we say, hey, if you're a school, show us that you're invested in your student success. Take these initial basic steps, and if you do these three things, you'll be able to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from the state to help bolster your work. It went really well. To date, the bill has been reapproved year after year since 2017. sending, as I mentioned, over $50 million to our colleges to pay for staff to run these pantries, to pay for refrigerators for pantries, and so many ways. A huge shout out to Bruins. Thank you, Mark. And this has really been a sign of a lot of grassroots activism. The only reason our state legislators believed that it was possible for us to do something like this is because for years, students and activists on the ground set an example, a case study for our legislators to believe that there are tangible solutions to this issue. So not only was the work that we were doing on campus bringing awareness to the issue, but it was saying, and here are solutions. And we're going to run these solutions for a few years, test them out, make sure they work, find out their kinks, and now bring them to you as proven solutions to this issue. So the cycle, I should say, between grassroots activism and policy change is very well linked. One leads to the other, and then the funding from the state leads to more programs, leads to more innovation, leads to better policy. And so I hope that any activism work you all are doing, you're always asking the question of how am I connecting this to more impact at the system level? We have so many answers for how you can do this. You can go to swipehunger.org/toolkit. You'll see tools for storytelling, tools for growing your own grassroots movement, understanding the political landscape, case studies, campaign planning. These are all free and accessible resources on our website designed for students, administrators, folks on the ground who want to plug in. So I definitely encourage you to get over to our website. And if you have any questions, if you want to get plugged in, if you go to advocacy, if you email advocacy@swipehunger.org, our director of advocacy, Rob, will email you within 5 seconds. So eager to plug in and help you. Think of a campaign. The first thing we say on calls is you all are experts. We're just here to help guide and support however we can. And of course, follow us on social media at @swipeouthunger. And with that, I'm going to pass it off. But that is a bit of a recap on college student hunger and how our state level work has been able to really advance this issue. And I'm now going to pass it off to my dear friend and colleague, Samantha from the Congressional Hunger Center. I hope you all know that everyone's bios are in the agenda, right? Or even if you just scroll down, you can click, I'm not reading bios because they're available. And I assume that you all know that anyone who's speaking here is a baller. So just click on bios, read what people have been up to. And yeah, please post questions on the HOVA app. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Rachel. All right, I have slides. Do I share that? Here they go. Okay. All right. Well, good morning to those of you on the West Coast. For those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. I hope we're not catching you in like the post-lunch slump. So I'm just gonna ask everyone I'm gonna ask you a few questions, so get ready to type, warm up your fingers a little bit. My name is Sam Stevens. I'm the manager of policy and strategic initiatives at the Congressional Hunger Center. And at the Hunger Center, we fight hunger by developing leaders. We run leadership development programs on issues of domestic and global hunger. And we also run the Zero Hunger Internship, which is a paid internship that teaches young people about anti-hunger work and public policy. So if you're interested in future jobs and hunger, give us a follow on all of the social media websites, because that's what we do. We also do public advocacy, and that's my job. So these are the 3 things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the federal social safety net, root causes of hunger and poverty, and charity versus justice. All right, so I'm going to start off by telling you some things that you probably already know about the federal programs. That's our focus, talking to Congress and people in the federal government about hunger in the United States and abroad and globally, but my focus is domestic, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the best estimates we have for hunger in the United States for 2020 is that about 50 million people experienced food insecurity last year, which is about a 13 million person increase from the previous year, which is, it's unprecedented. It's huge. And we were not ready for it. No one was ready for it. But that means even before the pandemic, that 37.2 million people were experiencing food insecurity in the United States. So before the pandemic and now, the number is just unreasonably high. Any number that's not zero is unreasonably high, but 50 million is just egregious. I'm sure everyone has seen the pictures at, I think it was like San Antonio Food Bank, of this parking lot full of cars for, getting the most essential thing. The pictures are astonishing. The numbers are astonishing. So many families and people that you know and I know have been impacted by the pandemic and by the economic fallout. So in the United States, food assistance for people who are experiencing food insecurity comes in two main forms, aside from aid and assistance from family and friends and mutual aid. So the first one you're probably very familiar with, the emergency food systems. That's food banks, food pantries, soup kitchens, meals provided at shelters, college pantries, religious institutions. And the second big group you're also probably pretty familiar with. It's the federal programs. It's WIC, SNAP, which is food stamps, child nutrition programs like school meals, school lunch, school breakfast, and food distribution programs on Indian reservations. So this is where I'm going to ask you to type. Of all of the food assistance in the United States, what percent do you think comes from the emergency food system? So that's like food banks and food pantries. And what percent do you think comes from the federal government? So I'll check the chat, read out your answers. So first one we have from Jordan is emergency food is 19% and the federal government is 81%. And from Skylar, we have emergency food system is 10%, federal government is 90%. Do we have any other guesses? So I'm seeing emergency 55%, 45% from the federal government. I'm seeing another emergency, or I'm seeing a flip, emergency food system 80% and federal government 20%. Well, try to do my slides. Could I move to the next slide? I don't know if I have control over that. Yeah, okay. So for those of you guess that the very small part comes from the emergency food system, you are correct. It even during administrations or congresses that aren't as in support of the federal nutrition programs, it is still 90%, this is from 2018, the statistic, 90% of food assistance in the United States comes from the federal nutrition programs, and only 10% comes from the emergency food system. And this is a huge flip. This is a huge mental flip for a lot of people in the United States, because what so many people are familiar with are food banks and food pantries, because they're important community centers. And those food banks and food pantries are essential for meeting people's needs in the moment. They meet people where they are, and that's really important, and that's really wonderful. But when we rely only on charity to meet people's most basic, most human, most essential needs, that's not justice. And we need to move food assistance from thinking about food assistance from charity to a justice framework. I'm just going to talk. These are my only 2 slides, because this is the image that I want you to take away from this presentation. This is really the most important thing that I want you to take away from my talk. So now I'm just going to, explain where I'm coming from and what the Hunger Center believes. So again, this charity to justice framework, look, it's a big misconception in the United States. And I've delivered presentations to state legislatures, for example, and they say, well, Samantha, my state is really generous. I believe that the people in my state don't need to rely on the federal government that much. And I believe that we can fill the gap to donate enough money to make sure that all people are food insecure. And that's just simply not true. It's true. Americans in the United States, very generous. We donate more than many other countries. We're a very generous country. However, its generosity is simply not enough. In my own home state of Georgia, I'm in DC now, but I'm a Georgian. In 2018, with the emergency food system and with the federal nutrition programs, there was still a $667 million shortfall that left people food insecure. So for everyone to be food insecure in the state of Georgia in 2018, on top of food banks and food pantries and the federal nutrition programs, we are still $667 million short. So that requires structural change. And that's what we're going to talk about. So I'll talk to you first about the federal nutrition programs to tell you about that 90%. In 2018, the national food insecurity average was 11.1%. And to give you an idea of who is food insecure, which is really important when we're talking about federal policy and structural change, if the national average is 11.1%, 20.2% of African American households experience food insecurity. So that's double the national average for African American households. That number was 16.2% for Latina households. So you can see that, and for white households, it was 8%, which is below the national average. The data is unclear on Native American communities, but we also know it's typically about double the national average. So we know that hunger does not impact every community the same. And we also know that, for example, female-headed households are much more likely to experience food insecurity. So those are all things that we're going to talk about when we're talking about advocacy and moving from a justice or a charity to justice mindset. But first, the 90%, what is the federal social safety net? So you're probably pretty familiar with SNAP already. Food stamps, SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Folks get an EBT card. There aren't that many restrictions on it. You can buy almost any food except for prepared food, hot food, pet food, at any grocery store or corner store that accepts SNAP. There are actually points of sale on college campuses for SNAP sometimes, which is a wonderful thing. And in 2019, it served about 38 million people. We're still getting the numbers in for 2020, but we know that there was a really dramatic increase because of the pandemic. And to give you an idea, the average benefit for a family of 3 in 2020, so the average amount of money that a family of 3 would have gotten on an EBT card is only $400. So that's quite low. For just 1 month, 3 people, $400, it's not that much. For one person, it was $138. We know that's not enough to afford a fully nutritious diet for a month. But I will add the caveat that if you qualify for SNAP, you should still absolutely apply for SNAP, even though it's not enough money to cover you for a full month. There's also the Women, Infants, and Children program. Serves millions of families each year. It's women, infants, and children who are up to 5, and it's lower benefits than SNAP. It's on average $62 per month per person, and it's specific vouchers for specific nutrient-dense foods. And then there's school meals. Most people are probably the most familiar with the school meal programs. It's free and reduced price school breakfast, school lunch, the summer meals. They also serve meals at childcare programs. And in 2019, again, 2020 data, so coming in, 2019, it served about 29 million kids. Just the school lunch program alone, 29 million unique children in the United States. And then less talked about, but really important, is the food distribution program on Indian reservations. FDIPR. Federal policy is a world of acronyms and alphabet soup. But FDIPR are boxes of culturally appropriate food that are distributed on Native American reservations and in the state of Oklahoma. And it serves about 75,000 people per month every year. Those programs are what we call the first line of defense, and they are part of how we end hunger. And how do you end hunger? You have to look at the root causes. So first, to end hunger, you have to provide a social safety net for people who are currently experiencing or at risk of experiencing food insecurity in the future. The federal nutrition programs that I just spoke about, they make up this nutrition social safety net, and they're the first line of defense against hunger when someone loses a job, experiences an illness, or goes through a difficult time. And we saw that during the pandemic. We know that SNAP participation increased. We know that without challenges from the pandemic, school meal participation would have increased. And there were other ways that we gave money to families called pandemic EBT to make sure that their kids still had money for food. The second way we end hunger is making sure that people have food access. So food access is lots of different things. People must be able to access nutritious food, meaning they have physical access to places where they can purchase food that are within 1 mile in urban areas or 10 miles in rural areas from their homes. This food must be culturally appropriate, so it meets their cultural needs. It's culturally familiar. It's what their family eats. And the food must also be affordable, so families don't have to make decisions between purchasing food or meeting other essential needs like rent or medical expenses. The third component of ending hunger is making sure that people have high quality, nutritious, and fresh food. A person experiences food insecurity when they do not have access to resources to purchase either the quantity or the quality of food. Quality is the second component of food insecurity. So that, number 3, to end hunger, people must have nutritious and fresh food. And finally, number 4, to end hunger, people must have quality jobs that provide enough income and that they have access to credit, housing, healthcare, and other resources that protect them from vulnerability to food insecurity. And when we talk about many of these things, these root causes of hunger, lack of access to credit, lack of access to housing, you see a history of racism and racial discrimination in the United States. And that's something that's really important for anti-hunger advocates to understand as you advocate for federal policies that prevent food insecurity in your communities. We move from charity to justice when we recognize the scale of the problem. And when we advocate for solutions that not only meet the immediate need, which is why the federal social safety net is so important because it meets that immediate need, but when we advocate for a full suite of public policies that help people have full economic security, quality jobs, access to credit, and access to the food that they want to eat for their families. And we can't rely on the charity of a community or how much food a food pantry may or may not have that day to support the needs of our neighbors, of the families in our communities, of our own families. That's why the social safety net is so important. And we can also advocate for nutrition programs that promote human dignity and investment in communities that are disproportionately likely to experience hunger. So one thing that I like to talk about of how do we think about equity when we're advocating for federal nutrition programs, I always cite Bread for the World when I'm talking about equity. So shout out to Jordan for working at an organization that has amazing research. But Bread for the World has this fantastic report by Marlisa Gamlin, and it's talking about applying a racial equity lens in federal public policy, the federal nutrition programs. And one thing that it says is increasing the SNAP benefit by 15%, which we actually just did in the COVID relief bills. Increasing the SNAP benefit by 15% helps the most vulnerable people the most. And one way that it improves equity in the nutrition assistance programs is that extra 15% increase helps communities that are living in urban food deserts and maybe even rural Indian reservations the most, because those are some of the places that have the highest food costs. So sometimes a policy that just seems good for everyone actually impacts those who need it the most. So if you're interested in racial equity in the federal nutrition programs, I really recommend going to Bread for the World's website and reading any of the work of Marlisa Gamlin. But I'll leave you with this. That was a crash course in federal nutrition policy and the importance of the social safety net and a mind shift from charity to justice. But I'll leave you with this. First, if you're interested, then I recommend you go to our website and sign up for the End Hunger in 30 challenge. It's a 30-day challenge on everything I just talked about, but much more in depth and said a lot better than I can say it. I really recommend that you talk to people who are different than you about hunger. Hunger used to be a very bipartisan issue, domestic hunger, and it is increasingly partisan. You know, 10 years ago when we passed the big bill that authorizes SNAP, there was a ton of support from both sides. This last time we did that in 2018, there was a lot less support in Congress. We still, you know, protected SNAP. It didn't have big cuts, but it's really important to talk to people who don't know about hunger, about why it's so important and why these federal nutrition programs, why that 90% is so important to protect. And third, talk to your members of Congress. If you go and set up a meeting with your member of Congress, you're probably the first person this year to talk to them about hunger. I know it seems like everyone's banging down their door about social issues, but that's really not the case. And like Rachel was saying, you know your community best, you know your situation best. And it is very valuable to educate members of Congress so they really understand what hunger looks like in their communities. I also want to say something about college SNAP, but I'm going to let Ashraf say that because he's going to say it a lot better than I am, but it's really important to be thinking about college SNAP right now. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Sam. I feel like I don't remember the last time I was at a conference where someone is like, how do we end hunger? And here are ways that we actually can end hunger and not just mitigate it or talk about it and make it a like philosophical thing. So thank you for being so on it, and of course bringing an important lens to it's, you know, hunger is there because people don't have good jobs and our policies aren't there to support them. So we're getting some amazing questions in the chat. I'm hoping that we can jump into them, but I'm really excited to hear Ashraf share something that's very personal to me, and I think everyone on this panel, about the role of advocacy on campus, which is really where we start to get our muscles around how policy change can start in our lives and beyond. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Ashraf.
Hello, everybody. Can I get the slides shared, please? Thank you very much. Let me see if I can control them on my end, or I can just queue them up for moving from slide to slide if that's okay. Awesome. So good morning to people on the West Coast and good afternoon to those on the East. My name is Ashraf Bishay. I'm the Policy Director of the University of California Student Association. At the UC, there are 285,000 students, and so there's a whole breadth of issues to talk about that manifest on the campus levels, but I'm happy to be here and talk to you about student hunger and basic needs in particular. Next slide, please.
If you use your keyboard, it should go to the next slide, I think. It's a slight delay.
Okay. So I wanted to show this data to speak about a question that was dropped in the chat. I conveniently had this as my my second slide, and this is the one of the questions that the UC surveys our students is around food insecurity and who is feeling food insecure at the University of California. You'll see here that about 38% of our students have indicated that they're either very low or low on food security at the UC, and so even though some of our institutions and all of our institutions have a really good reputation being research focused and really being machines of upward mobility, we see that there are certain elements of food insecurity on campuses. And you'll see amongst all the racial groups that no one group is not affected by food insecurity. Whichever community you identify with, there's at least 35, 34% of your community on our college campuses, at least in the UC, that are struggling with food insecurity. But still, you also see elements of inequity. You see a disproportionate effect on Black students who are facing food insecurity at a level that is way higher than other groups, and Latinx students as well. And so I wanted to share this because it's important to understand that student hunger affects all communities. And when a student goes hungry, it doesn't matter the race, but at the same time, by race, we see elements of inequity that manifest because of various ways that institutions don't accommodate for students' backgrounds and financial needs. And so I wanted to take this from a larger scope and to delve into some of the institutional policies that are in place to combat some of these inequities. Can we move on to the next slide? Or, oh, I control it here. All right, let's see. The first thing I wanted to talk about is a regental policy. So the University of California is governed by the Board of Regents. The financial aid model that is in place is meant to account for a student's total cost of attendance, meaning their tuition, but also their food and their housing and their healthcare costs. And so one of the region's policies, policy 3201, says explicitly that the university's financial aid system for undergraduate students is meant to be built on three elements: a manageable contribution from family resources, which takes into account a family's income, a manageable contribution from students taking some loans or working a few hours a week, and grants from the institution, grants from Pell Grant on the federal level, or grants from the Cal Grant on the state level, and also some private scholarships. And so
I hope he comes back.
I'm sorry, I got disconnected for a second. Do you all see me? Awesome. Pell Grant is a scholarship that's available for students whose families make under $50,000. And Cal Grant and institutional aid are meant to supplement those aid sources to cover a student's total cost of attendance. I'll move on to the next slide for time purposes, if I can. In 2014, Basic Needs was really gaining a lot of momentum, and it got on the UC president's radar, President Napolitano, and she established the Global Food Initiative, which is one of the co-sponsors of this conference. And so the Global Food Initiative was meant to really utilize and leverage the institution's research, education, and outreach efforts to look at food systems at the University of California to address food insecurity, and to look at ways for us to really conserve resources so that it comes back to benefit our community in the long run. A few years later, we saw that a lot of our campuses started building basic needs centers and food pantries. This has been a decade-long initiative, as Rachel was mentioning, but some of the smaller initiatives that were more so of food closets or food pantries really gained a lot of support and expansion in funding, that they were able to expand more robustly and actually have staff members that would help students enroll in things like CalFresh that provide monthly assistance for our students on a regular basis. And so what went from being sort of a harm reduction place that provides immediate assistance in food for students became more of an institutional system to support students to tap into existing resources on the federal level. In 2019, because of a lot of advocacy happening on the UC student end, the California legislature approved $15 million to go into annual funding support to address both food and housing insecurity at the University of California's 10 campuses. This was monumental for us because we utilized some of this funding to do two things. First of all, to provide immediate financial relief and food support for our students, but also develop a framework of system-wide leaders and professional experts who understand the importance of tackling basic needs from a research and data-based lens as well. It is to put some backing behind the existing needs that we know students have through a professional lens, to be able to communicate with legislators in a long-term fashion and to introduce some longevity to the basic needs work instead of simply placing it on the back of students who we know are oftentimes leaving campuses quicker than some of these priorities require attention. This may not be specific to just food only, but I wanted to introduce some of the data that we had around time to degree for our students and their graduation rates, their retention rates. And you'll see that there are significant equity gaps that exist in the University of California because of lack of robust financial aid systems. The UC provides about $1 billion in institutional aid, and yet we have major equity gaps because of things like a stagnant Pell Grant that hasn't increased significantly in a long while. So for instance, as an example here, you'll see between our freshman students, their 4-year graduation rates, who are Pell students are graduating at 63%, while non-Pell students are graduating at 74%. So that's an 11% equity gap based on whether you're a low-income person who has to rely on a Pell Grant that has not been increasing for a while, or whether you are financially secure enough to not need Pell Grant. And so this data is so crucial because we are trying to understand who is requiring the most support and how does basic needs translate into significant institutional shortcomings when we make a promise at a campus that students are going to graduate in 4 years, and yet about a third of our students are not. And so the consequences of basic needs are quite grave, and we need to relay those to legislators and decision makers to understand that student hunger and homelessness oftentimes have major consequences down the road as well. So I wanted to get back to the basics. And in the University of California Student Association, we always see the financial aid system as a tool to eliminating student hunger and basic needs. The issue at hand is that the cost of education is increasing, but financial aid isn't keeping pace. And that some policies bar certain students, especially undocumented students, for instance, or international students, from receiving the aid that they may need. And so those communities oftentimes are disproportionately affected by student hunger because they don't have safety networks. There are several solutions to address this. The first is investing more into financial aid. Sometimes we talk about financial aid policy, but oftentimes it's about expanding the pie to ensure that there is more funding overall that can be allocated based on those new equitable policies. The UCSA is leading a campaign over the past few months and into the next year around doubling the Pell Grant. And doubling the Pell Grant would bring us from about $6,400 a year per student to about $13,000. The second solution is to develop more robust infrastructure to tackle hunger while utilizing the statewide and federal programs to support students. And the third one is continuing to educate policymakers on the prevalence of this issue. Sometimes folks look at college and they think it's only about tuition, which is untrue. At the University of California, if you're entering as a student, about half of your expenses will go towards housing and food compared to the other half being on tuition. And so raising awareness on the cost of attendance is absolutely crucial, and addressing financial aid from that lens. My last slide is ways that you can help directly. Following student associations is so crucial. A lot of your student leaders are already advocating on behalf of you on student hunger and student homelessness issues. And so being part of their lobbying efforts, uplifting those campaigns is absolutely essential. The second thing is meet with your elected officials, whether it's an assembly member or a senator or other elected officials. Oftentimes they have direct authority over budgetary decisions that can provide more resources to your community. The third thing is utilizing legislation. There is, for instance, in California, SB 464 as a piece of legislation that would expand regular support for undocumented students to get a CalFresh equivalent program because they're ineligible to CalFresh on a federal level. The fourth thing is to join our campaign to double Pell. There's been 10 different statewide associations that have backed our campaign. We've been having weekly events, and we had a week-long campaign a month ago where we've met with different coalition partners and Hill staffers to uplift that priority. Doubling the Pell Grant puts money directly in the pockets of low-income students so that they don't have to rely on harm reduction programs like basic needs centers. And so to us, it's about addressing the systemic issue in play here, which is that students don't have enough money to go through college. The final thing is, and I don't want to underestimate this, volunteering and working at a food pantry or basic needs center is really meaningful work. Oftentimes we think about policy on the large scale and its large scale impact, but we need people to be in the centers, meeting with students and supporting them day to day to understand the urgency of acting. And oftentimes these narratives are what really put force and power behind our advocacy efforts. So I hope that gives you some insight into some of our priorities.
Thank you so much, Ashraf. I don't know how you did that in so few minutes. It was a lot of incredible information. And as I mentioned, we've gotten so many wonderful questions, and somehow we've reached our time. So I threw them in the chat. We're going to work to try and get as many of these answered in advance and in the days and weeks to come. But just wanted to shout out that you now have a break. You've got about 30 minutes, go grab lunch. We all know how important food is. If at any conference, it's this one. But also check out the short tutorial about how to engage with posters and presenters and watch the preview video. So at 12:30 Pacific time, when that next session starts, you'll know which one you want to attend and how you can join. I want to thank our panelists again. Thank you, Jordan, Sam, Ashraf. This was really packed with so much amazing information that I hope folks are walking away not just clear on the importance of advocacy in all of this work. Advocacy and policy is really how we make a big difference, but starting to see how it really doesn't matter if we each step up, right? It's up to us. And so Jordan's throwing a link in the chat. I'll throw in our swipe one as well. Check out our toolkit, plug into our work, take the Zero Hunger Challenge at the Congressional Hunger Center, get involved in your campus's public affairs and policy teams. Send them an email, right? Send the Ashraf equivalent of your campus or your system and say, hey, where's food security on your priority list, right? Where's Pell on your priority list? It really does make a difference. And so with that, I hope everyone has an amazing day and continued learning throughout the conference.